Hey guys, welcome back to our next module. This week or chapter, we're going to cover Latin America. Um, so Latin America, and again, when we talk about this, is kind of where we're really going to start understanding a little bit more about what we mean by a region, not just physical geography, because physical geography, we tend to separate the Americas, and this is from a North American perspective. We tend to separate the Americas by North America and South America, and that division basically being here with Panama Canal. Um, Even more like a smaller regional perspective, then we would take North America, which again is what we talked about last week, Central America, which is basically everything from Mexico to Panama, and then we have down here as well South America. Now, the other part, and in this unit, we're going to talk about what it means to be Latin. Why is Latin America? Because you'll see we have three countries here, Guyana, French Guiana, and Suriname, which are not counted as part of Latin America. So again, this is stepping back from physical geography, and this is looking at more of a broader sense of what we mean by a region. So what characteristics, what are the common characteristics here? There are also, and you'll see we have this is a plate boundary, but plate boundary nonetheless kind of gives us a different perspective. Where there are countries, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, that speak Spanish, which is part of the shared quote unquote Latin culture. Yet these are considered Caribbean countries. They aren't considered to be part of Latin America in this grand scheme of these 12 regions. Um, so this is kind of the first time, and I think by the time we get to like Central Asia, South Asia, you see, for example, Pakistan is in South Asia, you're gonna be like, what the heck? Why isn't that in what is often referred to as the Middle East, for example? Um, so there's a lot more than just what we view a country as today based on ethnic or linguistic reasons or factors contributing to why it is where it is, or in this region classification. Um, so this is kind of the first chapter where we'll start exploring, why these countries are placed together in one region. So Latin America in general, this is a region of contrast and similarity. So, and this will become a little bit more relevant. So by similarity, I mean there's a shared Latin culture. Now, Latin is coming from, obviously not Latin as in the language, Latin, the extinct language, but coming from a Latin, again, I feel like every time I say Latin, I'm talking about like, the language, but this is like a Latino culture. And this is why you get Brazil, which does speak actually Portuguese, is actually part of this. And I would even argue that there are, and we'll see when we get to the Caribbean, we'll talk about a couple countries. Belize is one of these, but there are a couple other countries that, Honduras, for example, that you could again go back to questioning whether or not they really should be considered part of this region. Another thing that this region really shares is a colonial history. So Portugal and Spain colonized the majority of this region to some extent, and who got what and where they were allowed to conquer is based on a treaty that we'll talk about in this unit as well. Um, but there is a shared culture, and so, and the approach might have been different. Like if you look at Uruguay, for example, where a lot of the indigenous population was killed, and where you go to the Pacific coast, and a lot of the indigenous population was saved in order to use as slave labor. So it can be quite distinct from one country to the other, but realistically speaking, the colonial history of most of this region is quite similar. So some of the contrasts, that's very racially diverse. This is very evident in any of these countries. You have, geographically speaking, you have high mountains and you have a very, low river basins and lowlands. And in Ecuador alone, I always find it so amazing. We have, not including the Galapagos Islands, we have three main regions. You have the coastal regions and deltas, which constantly spend most of the year flooding, or half the year, you'd say. You have the Andes Mountains, which the foothills of the Andes are 10,000 feet. The peaks of the Andes can be in the 20,000s. And then you have the Amazon to the east, what we call the Orient as well. Um, the I find it so distinct because it's a country about the size of Colorado. It can literally take you an entire day because you're not just driving straight across, you're climbing 14,000 feet and then going back down the other side. Um, so again, the geography varies so much. There's also disparate levels of development. So you go to some countries such as Chile, which has a much more quote unquote advanced development, a lot more economic stability, a lot more political stability in the recent decades. And then you go to other countries, Bolivia, which are really quite poor still, even within a country. You might have 10 families that own 90 some percent of the wealth. And then 99% of the rest of the population that owns less than 10% of the wealth in the country. Another characteristic of this region is that there is extensive natural resources, quite a vast quantity of natural resources. And it's not just that when you get to the Middle East, for example, pretty much your only natural resource is petroleum products, but this region we have minerals, we have oil, we have gas, we have water, biodiversity, plants and animals. It's very very extensive natural resource group or area. So physical geography. Break down a little bit. This is shows a little bit. You can see here the Andes Mountains is about 5,000 foot, or sorry, 5,000 mile long cordillera. We call it mountain range. It goes from all the way up here, all the way down to Chile. Um, we'll talk about some interesting mountain and temperature facts. Um, so you can see there is quite a high elevation, and then as well we have quite low elevations, and this here would be primarily the Amazon, what we call the Amazon jungle. So we have uplands of Mexico and Central America. Another thing that makes it distinct about this region is where people have settled. Yes, most people have settled along the coastlines, but no, it hasn't been quite that clear. So the Andes Mountains, and you'll see this here. The Andes Mountains are 5,000 miles long, the end of the mountain chain. The highest point is 22,830 feet. The world's mountains, I always love to point this out. I learned this when I lived in Ecuador. So if we talk about the world's tallest mountain, there's three ways we can look at it. So the mountain that is the highest above sea level is Mount Everest, the Himalayas. You have the world's tallest mountain. So from the base of the mountain all the way to its top, it's actually Mauna Kea on the Big Island here in Hawaii. And then the mountain that is closest to the sun is actually just south of the equator in Ecuador, and it's in the Andes mountain range. It's called Chimborazo. And this is because the way the Earth bulges, it's not a perfect sphere, it actually slightly bulges along the equator. That point along the bulge actually makes the top of that mountain closer to the sun than Mount Everest. So it's just a little geography quick fact for you. You can always, if you're ever, I suppose, at a party and you want to make small talk and be made fun of, probably. But anyways, the shields. So these shields are these low-lying flatlands. Patagonia, there's the Brazilian shields, the Guiana shields, further up north as well. And this is where you actually see a lot of people who have settled, not necessarily near river basins. And this is again largely associated with the fact that river basins flood. So some of the bigger river basins, we have the Amazon, the Plata, the Orinoco. The Amazon is the largest in the world. 20% of the world's freshwater supply is in this river. And the Amazon rainforest has over 100,000 species of plants and animals. It's an amazing, so one of the most biodiverse and rich biodiverse areas in the whole entire world. So climate and climate change. So we largely have tropical, mid-latitude, and polar climates. Again, this goes very far south. A lot of people who want to travel to Antarctica actually have to go to Chile or Argentina down here in order to take the boats and the quote-unquote cruises to the Antarctic. There's little temperature variation in the tropical areas year-round. When I lived in Galapagos, we basically had two weather currents that influenced with the weather that came down from the Cocoa Islands up here off the coast of Costa Rica that would come down and bring warm, humid environments or warm, humid temperatures. And then we had the Humboldt current, which came down here from Antarctica, and it would come up and it would bring very cold waters, like upper 50s it could get down to. It was quite cold, and this is coming from Oregon, quite comparable weather or water temperatures, realistically speaking. The weather, the air temperature itself never really matched this, but it did get a little bit colder than Hawaii, to give you a reference. But generally speaking, there's little temperature variation, especially in places like the Amazon, in places like the Andes Mountains. There's very little temperature variation year round. A lot of these regions just might have a rainier season and a less rainier season. So latitude and elevation, as well as rainfall patterns, play a huge role in this region. We'll talk about when we get here to the next page as well. You can actually see the temperature variations. So these red lines are the temperatures. You can see there's very little temperature variations. Here down in southern Argentina and Buenos Aires, we do. But again, that's, this is down at 35, 40 degrees south of the equator. So it's the same thing as you would find more or less in northern Arizona. Chile as well, in Punta Arenas all the way down here. There's a little bit of a variation, but still not quite as much as you might expect from that consideration of like a northern latitude. And then latitude, as we'll talk about here, or sorry, not elevation also plays a huge factor in climate for a lot of these areas. So there is very complex climate patterns in the mountains. So this is what we call an altitudinal zonation. So we have these different ecosystems based on these altitude zones. Now, if you're from the Pacific Northwest, you might be slightly more familiar with this concept. So a lot of times, if you're from the East Coast, we'll talk about, is there a storm front coming in? Is there a cold front coming in the winter? And if there's a cold front moving in, then we expect the temperatures. Now, in the Pacific Northwest, this is probably similar in a lot of other mountain ranges and mountain areas of North America, and as well as other places, but this is the most familiar example I have to provide you with, is you go up and up in elevation and you get these different zones, ecosystem zones, but they're largely associated with temperature. And this can also be found, we had the same similar concept in Hawaii. You can find this in Galapagos, we had this as well, but this is just a lot more distinct because the elevation goes up much higher. And we refer to something called an environmental lapse rate. So basically, it's the higher up you go, the colder it gets. And you can see here as well, so there's just sea level, 3,000, 6,000, 12,000, 15,000, and then we have the snow line. In North America, where you can go up higher and higher, still we'd call this a timberline as well, so where the trees stop growing. And again, remember, as you go up, you also get a reduction in oxygen. There's a lot of other variables at play as well here. So this is showing us on the left what kind of products they could have grown at these different elevations and at different altitudes. But we also get the temperature changes quite a bit as well. So the further up you go, the colder it gets. Your book has a formula and it tells you, I think it's like 1.5 degrees for every 100 feet or something, for example. I don't remember exactly what it is, but I just want you to understand that this is a huge factor in controlling and influencing climate patterns. So the Western Mountains, and as well as reciprocally, we've got that actually looks like a llama, but you see we have a llama, alpaca, and the vicuña are actually three different species, which are quite similar. The llama tends to be the biggest one. The vicuña is the smallest one. The Andes, so even at the Andes, you'll get this flat area, which we call the Altiplano. And this is where a lot of the people have lived, especially even more so in these valley areas between the mountains. And I think the highest city, if I'm not mistaken, is La Paz, Bolivia, where it goes up to 14,000 feet. Other regions are a little bit lower. Quito, Ecuador is about 10,000 feet. I lived in a city called Chimborazo in the middle of Ecuador, which is about 11,000, 12,000 feet. It can be quite difficult on your body as well to adjust to this altitude. A couple other regions we call the uplands and the shields. So again, the shields are flat areas. I'm not really too concerned about you knowing these, just kind of having a familiarity, because these regions, this is a very distinct area. River basins. So river basins play a huge part in this area, especially for a lot of countries that are now trying to develop alternate sources of energy. And there's been a lot of dam building over the last couple of decades, which again has a lot of environmental repercussions and implications. So physical geography and environmental issues. Neotropics is a phrase that we often use, especially for this region. So it's a tropical ecosystem of the Americas. It has developed in isolation And because of that, has very unique flora and fauna. So think of, we often refer to the tropics as other areas. This is the neo, so this is the new world, which is where that's coming from as well. These ecosystems have become very important population centers. And as we've seen this is where the majority of the people have settled in these areas. You do get some people who settle in the highlands, but generally the populations tend to be much less. And we are seeing now this growing environmental movements around the region. This is partly, I would say, a good chunk to do is with the influence of social media as well. Um, there's also, I would say, part of this could have come from 21st century socialism, countries wanting to take back some of their rights to their natural resources rather than having corrupt presidents sell those rights to foreign companies. We'll talk about some examples as well. So another huge factor in this region regarding climate is El Nino. I'm hoping most of you have probably heard about this, depending on where you're from. It does affect us a little bit. You can see Hawaii up here on this map. So El Nino is largely, we associate it mostly with differences in weather patterns, but it comes largely from ocean currents. So El Nino warms up the normally cold Pacific current. So this current that comes from the Western, sorry, I always have to still get my directions. The Western Pacific all the way across the Eastern Pacific. We, from this perspective, we think of this as the West and we think of this as the East. So looking at it that way should still even make more sense. But anyways, so it's a phenomenon. We also call it the Pacific Interdecadal Oscillation. So basically, it used to be a little bit more of what we believe to be a predictive pattern where it happened every decade or so, and there would be this shift. So we see this water temperature raising, and so there's a continual current shift, and that happens in the Pacific anyways. But whereas what we see is much warmer water, and this warmer water then influences the rest of weather patterns. In some regions, this results in droughts, and in other regions, this can result in floods. So there was one big El Nino we had, which was in the winter of 1997 and then followed through in the next year of 1998. I know the ocean temperatures that summer up in Oregon were phenomenally high. It was like in the low 60s, which is unheard of. But you can see here this dramatic increase in open temperatures. So this is an anomaly. So this is much more than it normally is. So this is a little bit cooler, but this is much hotter than it normally is. El Nino causes a lot more rainfall, especially in places like the Galapagos Islands. It heavily affects the Galapagos Islands. We get a lot of rainfall, and therefore a lot of animal species actually aren't able to successfully reproduce in that year, and the populations can dramatically have a decline as well, especially if it also it factors in and influences food sources for a lot of these animals. But when we usually talk about it, again, coming from an anthropocentric perspective, we usually talk about it as the weather patterns that we see. So the warm Pacific current that every few years arrives along the coastal Ecuador and Peru in December doesn't mean that these impacts are only felt there. So in most years, the warm water is held over here in the Western Pacific. It doesn't necessarily pass it all the way. And so then you can see here we have an El Nino year, so massive. And this goes all the way up north as well through the western coast of the United States. So you can see here how this is showing us how it influences the weather patterns. So you're getting a lot more evaporation. So think about, as we talk about, just to kind of, understand, okay, well, what's the big deal, right? Hurricanes have been increasing because ocean temperatures have also been increasing. This region does not get hurricanes, just to clarify. But hurricanes gain their fuel and gain their power and momentum largely based on the ocean temperatures. The warmer it is, the more fuel they can get. So this normal upwelling, so you can just understand how ocean temperatures have increased, we get this much more stronger storms. So, just having it heating up, 4 degrees Celsius warmer than normal will, obviously, again, influence weather as well. So this normal upwelling of cold water in the Eastern Pacific Ocean does not occur. which then results in massive fish kills. So when I talked about that Humboldt current coming up from the north, it can't compete with this current. And it's that cold current that brings a really nutrient dense and nutrient rich waters that most fish species need to survive. And then we get changes in global pressure systems, which disrupt weather patterns worldwide. So, again, this isn't just warmer water on the eastern Pacific. This is now colder water in the western Pacific. So this has drastically can influence weather patterns around this huge multiple regions, right? So we get droughts in Indonesia and Australia, and then we get really heavy rains in Western America. North and south can be. So in Latin America, we also get droughts in Brazil, Venezuela, Colombia, Central America. It's not just all flooding, but we do get flooding in Peru, Chile, Bolivia, and Paraguay, as well as Ecuador. And then this obviously has ultimate effects as well as widespread weather disturbances around the world. So you can see drought will result in other factors such as fires. And there was a hurricane up here this year that they were representing this in Guatemala. So it can, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee that, right? So Latin American climate change. Higher elevation regions are more affected by the warming trend. So again, as we will see, it will eventually start sounding like a broken record. Climate change affects glaciers. A lot of places around the world depend on glaciers for year-round water supply. The Andes are no different. Accelerated melting of Andean glaciers reduce future drinking water supplies. There is, and this is not necessarily related to climate change. It is related, but not directly or not only because of climate change. It's also because of a change of technology. You can go and you Google or find on YouTube this guy who is the last ice brick. I don't even know what to call him, but this was a guy who, the tallest mountain, I said, based on the bulge factor, the Chimborazo. There was this man, and they used to bring ice down from the mountains. They would go in and carve out big blocks of ice and bring them down and sell the ice. And that's how these people made a living. And it's pretty much a dying livelihood. And last I knew, there was one man still doing it. So people, as an older man. And so people would go and make movies or documentaries, interview him. And then as we see this, not only, obviously there's a temperature factor that's influencing glaciers, which means that it's also warmer weather in higher areas, which has allowed certain mosquitoes and other insects to now encroach and keep going further up, which has obviously resulted in mosquito-borne diseases, also infecting highland areas, which previously didn't happen. And then this as well can also have a possible impact on El Nino, this reduction in glaciers. Again, this could be pretty much anywhere in the world now. So this is let me see if I can, how to say it, the Chacataya, which is not Spanish. It would be from an indigenous language. But you can see here on the left we have 1966, the glacier, and then in 2009, there's virtually nothing left. So again, what does this mean? So some of the more immediate concerns are agricultural productivity, reduction in water, water availability, changes to ecosystems, as well as potential disease. So disease for animals, plants, as well as for humans. Some other environmental issues. So this is a region that is largely one of the, the largest lungs, we could call it, of the world through the Amazon forest, which is being deforested at high rates. So this is showing us, this is a population density map. You can see that it's not a very, population in some areas is highly dense, in other places it's not. The Amazon, so this is mostly here, all of the Amazon forest, and a lot of these areas are encroaching on the Amazon as well. But forest conservation and forest destruction is a huge issue here. So tropical rainforests. Here's the thing about tropical rainforests. They're highly, highly rich in nutrients. They're highly rich in biodiversity, meaning flora and fauna, plants and animals. But here's the thing, is that all of the richness exists above the soil. The soil becomes rich and stays rich because there's a constant supply of organic material that is falling from the trees and falling from the plants, and it creates this continual system that goes to provide nutrients into the soil. Realistically speaking, once you were to cut that cut the source and cut the forest out, cut the trees out, the soil becomes very poor and infertile almost immediately. So tropical rainforests it's a very interesting ecosystem. They cover only 6% of the Earth's landmass, but they contain half of the world's species. This is what I mean by they're very rich, they're very biodiverse. And so here's just some images of the Brazilian Amazon deforestation. You can see this is from 2000 to 2010, the same satellite images. You could match these up. And this is the kind of thing we would do in GIS. So we might overlay and do this map versus that map, and you would go and put them and draw the points and try to measure certain points. This point here obviously is with this point here, and then we could go and compare and see how much has changed and altered. And so, you can also see that there's some rhyme and pattern in this deforestation. So there is some type of organization. It basically makes it look like clear cutting or maybe land that's using for grazing or grasslands. It doesn't necessarily look like it's being inhabited. Maybe in certain parts. You can see here there was obviously burning going on. These are clouds, but there is some type of smoke burning. There still is, it looks like minimal burning, some minimal smoke sources. So in this, we call this system of grassification. A lot of the forests are being converted into pasture, which again does not stay fertile for very long, meaning you constantly need to then move on and get more land. And a lot of this cattle is actually being used to supply the U.S. beef addiction, maybe we could call it. We consume a lot of beef per capita. Another thing that we are seeing is nationally protected lands. This picture here is Manuel Antonio. It's in Costa Rica. This is actually where I ended up doing my dissertation research. This was interesting as well, as this had been a rainforest. It's technically kind of is a rainforest. Had been a rainforest, had been privately purchased, had been kind of used for different farming lands at different times, was privately purchased, and the foreigner who owned it wanted to convert it into a huge resort. Well, the people didn't agree with that. It was basically a really it's an amazing beach area. Manuel Antonio National Park, if you ever get to go there, it is beautiful. But the people would go in and be able to use the beach areas, and then basically these private owners restricted entrance and wanted to privatize the whole area and create a resort, and the locals weren't happy with this, and they petitioned and eventually got the government to take the land back from the private owners and turn it into a national park. And this is how we see, especially with countries like Costa Rica, where they've done this amazing system of national parks, and a lot of them are actually privately owned. And a lot of other places, the Galapagos Islands is actually all national park and protected area or marine reserve, and only 3% of the land is actually allowed to be inhabited. So we are seeing, and that is also an extreme case, but we are seeing more and more growth in national parks and protected areas in a lot of this area. So some of the urban environmental challenges, air pollution, especially in some places in the Andes. So Santiago is part of Chile, and you can see it's this valley with these massive mountains, and depending on wind and airflow, a lot of times the contamination can just get stuck in these valleys for quite a long time. I've been in Quito, Ecuador. I know at times where there's not a lot of wind, it becomes very difficult for me to breathe, especially if, when I'm not used to something like that. Water issues. A lot of these areas are also in, you might find, for example, in the Amazon, they have a lot of water, but in the mountains, it's actually a desert. It's a very arid environment, and that's quite, it makes it quite challenging. And it's not necessarily easy to pump water from a coastal region up, 20,000 feet to supply water. It takes a lot of energy to do something like that. Peru has a lot of water issues as well, which led to an environmental dispute and them taking and claiming a huge chunk of the Amazon rainforest. I think it was about 15, 20 years ago now. But you do see as well, and partly this is due to economics, but a lot of this is policy as well. Transportation has become a huge issue in a lot of these cities. These were colonial cities. They have been built up. They weren't necessarily designed as we see, so if you're in a mountain area, there's not necessarily a lot of space to continue expanding. and how to expand. And there is huge rates of urbanization that we'll talk about. So there has been a lot more focus on mass transportation, I would say, than we would see here. Biking in some places, still not huge, super huge like we have in some places in the United States. Um, yeah, no, there's definitely a lot more focus on mass transportation and public transportation than you would see in other areas. Different systems as well have tried to control a lot of the mass individual transportation. I know we have a system in Ecuador in Quito called the Pico y Placa, where if your your license plate number ends with an odd number, you can't drive, or it's, I don't know, I have to think, sorry, let me back up. If your license plate ends with like 0 or 1, you can't drive on Mondays. If it ends with 2 or 3, you can't drive on Tuesdays. And then et cetera, all the way through, the 10 numbers Monday through Friday. But then ultimately, is what a lot of people have done. If they can afford it, they go and get a second car. So again, leading just more challenges for poor people. The Amazon, I'm not going to show you this time lapse, but I recommend I give you the web page here to go and check out this time lapse of you can see the destruction. So there's the actual Amazon forest, the Amazon River Basin as well, which has many subsidiary or secondary rivers that feed into it and then come out of it as well. It's really sad to see the amount of rainforest that has been destroyed, and it is a beautiful place to go. If you ever have the opportunity to go to the Amazon jungle, I highly recommend it. It really is an overwhelmingly, amazingly beautiful place. So here you can see some of the different attempts to preserve. One attempt, this is Brazil who did this, they created this protected tree system. So certain trees, certain types of species of trees became protected. Well, you can see here in the top left what has happened is that they've just kept those trees and taken everything else. A lot of this land has resulted in being transferred to soy farming. Again, then soy is being used to, a lot of the foods we consume are processed foods that have soy in them, or soy is then used to feed cattle as well. Um, Another important thing, but then again, you can see how well, and again, what we talked about with the tropical, the neotropics, and all of the nutrients being actually in the above the ground. So as soon as it becomes useless and no longer can produce, they're going to have to go and start chopping on this area of the forest to then gain more land. We also have an important thing about this is that these are carbon sinks. So it's not just about the fact that we need the trees to clean the carbon and clean the air and continue to produce more oxygen, but the trees themselves, the plants themselves, and even what's stored in the ground are actually carbon sinks. So basically it's like, think of it as like a bank account. The carbon is stored in these areas. Part of the reason that we talk about climate change is that we're releasing more carbon, but even just by cutting down these forests, it's not a matter of taking away the natural mechanism we have for cleaning the air, but we're also releasing more carbon that had been currently stored or previously stored. Just to kind of give you a status, Brazil committed that by 2030 they were going to halt deforestation. But again, illegal logging is very hard to control and stop. Brazil is a massively huge country. And then Brazil just recently opened the Amazon to different types of controversial mining. You see this every couple of years at least. Tribes with no human contact are yearly being murdered, a lot of times by loggers and miners. 60% of the deforestation that's occurring in the Amazon is related to the cattle industry, so that they can grow sufficient beef to send to the States as well as others. And I want to talk briefly about this case in Ecuador called the Yasuni, the TTP we call it. So basically, we had a president who, Rafael Correa, his name, he's 21st century socialist, and he went and he made a plea to, I believe it was the EU, or one of the G summits, and he basically said, look, we've got this huge proven oil reserve, massive, and it's under one of the most pristine tracts of the Amazon rainforest, one of the most biodiverse and rich areas in the whole entire world. I calculate that oil would give my country so many billions of dollars. I want to say it was like $13 or $20 billion, $15 billion. I'm willing to set that land aside and not touch it, but I need that money for my country. So if you're willing to help us get that money, then I will not do that. Fortunately, no other countries actually offered to pay into it. We did quite a bit of fundraising within the country and generated actually a decent amount of money, not in the billions, but millions. I don't know whatever happened to that money, but basically it became open. So in 2012, you can find articles or references that say, the Yasuni is the world's conservation. Hopes rest on Ecuador's bold Yasuni model. By 2016, articles were titled things like ticking time bomb for the planet, because no one responded, at least how the president had hoped. He went ahead and opened it to oil drilling. And it has now been, it's not just drilling the oil. A lot of oil spills happen. You have to cut down the forest. You have to go in. There's a lot of destruction that's related to the oil drilling. This area is also highly characterized by natural disasters. This is the last part of the lecture. Natural disasters. We're in class that ask you, what do you associate with natural disasters? Most of us probably think of hurricanes, earthquakes, tornadoes, depending on where you're from and what you've been exposed to. Volcanoes are also a natural disaster. And it becomes questioned, and we'll talk about it at certain points as well, about how natural a lot of what we call natural disasters today are, because they're being exacerbated by human influences. So natural disasters will result in the loss of lives and or properties triggered by natural forces. So some examples are volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, hurricanes, flooding, mudslides, droughts, and wildfires. So this region largely is plagued by natural disasters. Obviously, the Andes Mountains are volcanoes. Generally, you don't hear too much about volcanic explosions. There is one that I'll give you an example here of Tungurahua. Earthquakes have been a huge factor that are associated as well with the Andes. Earthquakes that result in, there's a lot of, plate and tectonic activity as well. This is a subduction zone, which has created the Andes Mountains. We will talk about this at some point, but basically you get one plate that's going under another plate, and it can slip, causing earthquakes. It can also, this is what creates the magma and the hot spots that then create the volcanoes as well, which are associated with their own system of earthquakes as well. There was a major earthquake in Ecuador. This was in 2000. I was actually supposed to be in the country, and I was supposed to be leaving 2 days after this earthquake struck, but something happened requiring us to leave earlier. So this was in April 2016. A massive earthquake, and the buildings, as you can see, the coastal areas were just destroyed. Look in the bottom right, this building there's nothing left of it. I'm guessing it was at least a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, at the very least a 6-story building. Quite a few lives were lost. And, it's just a lot of these places, this happens a lot. This happens in Chile as well. Mexico is not spared by any means. They have a quite similar system as well. They also have active volcanoes. And the infrastructure, a big thing here is the infrastructure is not equipped to handle such types of movements. So here is some pictures from the Chilean earthquake and tsunami, which was, I can't remember if it was, 2011, I want to say it was, March or February of 2011. So it was an earthquake that happened right off the coast and resulted in a huge tsunami that came and again killed, I believe, is into the thousands of people. And it was felt the tsunami did reach Hawaii as well. I believe it's only about a meter-foot wave. Here's just another example, and this becomes a part of everyday life in some ways. In many ways, this is Tungurahua in Ecuador. Tungurahua has an active volcano. It's a very active volcano. I've seen ash spewed from this on the bottom left. That's a very common sight. There's this town called Baños, which means baths. And you can see if this volcano were to erupt, the pathway for the pyroclastic flow would be straight down here and basically wipe out the city. It's a big tourist hub. This is like a halfway point between the Andes and the Amazon jungle. So a lot of people pass through here. A lot of ecotourism activities as well, nature-based tourism activities. So it's very quite popular. And there are different points in time where they have forced evacuation for months, 6, 7, 8 months, I think close to a year at a time, because just the danger that it imposes on people. But again, it's beautiful to see. It can be very active, constantly erupting, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to have a huge eruption that would kill people. So a couple updates. So in August 2006 was regarding Tungurahua. There was an eruption that killed 7 people and buried several villages. Authorities had ordered an evacuation in July, but only about 4,000 people from about 30,000 people did evacuate. The first time I was in Banyas was in 2010, and there had been an evacuation, a forced evacuation. Everyone pretty much had left, and they weren't allowed back for a long time. So this has now resulted in a lot of people not leaving. February 2008, another eruption prompted an evacuation of about 3,000 villagers on just the western slopes. And there were major eruptions in May and December of 2010, April 2011, as well as December 2012. So this is a very common occurrence there. But this is just one of the many examples of natural disasters in this region. So anyways, let me know if you have any questions. Have a great day.